First of all, it's a very complex space because so many people go through it, different objectives and so on. But essentially it's a transition space. People come on a journey, they get off at Viti, then they go out and they move into another sort of set of experiences and activities and so on. So in that sense, to use a term that used to be very popular with social scientists, it's a liminal place. Literally, you're moving across the threshold. In a different sense, symbolically, Viti can be seen as a transition point for the British Raj. It was a statement about British power and their liking for progress and the bringing to India of the modern objects, the modern discoveries that made Britain the power that it was. It's also a transition point for trains carrying goods, trains collecting produce from overseas through the port facilities and carrying them into the rest of India. Under the British, it was the rail facilities from the docks, which were also part of the Viti complex. These trains would collect British soldiers, collect British officials. They'd get off the boat, go through customs, and then board trains which would take them into the interior of India. And yet, of course, it's a building that was created by Indian artisans, craftsmen, artists, planners, clerks, and so on. So it also has a hybrid quality as being part of India. You know, in the common phrase, if the stones of Viti could speak, you'd get many different stories. It's possible to write many different sorts of histories of Viti. One of them, I think, is that it's a history of modern science and its place there. It's also, at another level, a history of the people who go through it and the people who make it. And here I'm thinking of some Marathi short story writers who use the railway line and what happens on it and what happens when they get to Viti. There's one story of a villager who's talking to another person on the train, and one of them is leaving home and going to Mumbai, in order to get at the pots of gold that line the rich city streets. And the other one whom he's talking to has left his village because he was driven out by a riot. And both of them are sharing the common experience of moving through Viti, both with very different drives and very different aspirations, one out of desperation and the other out of the desire to win and gain and succeed. When there were terrible famines in India, particularly the ones in 1876 and 1877, when there was a massive lack of food, people were dying because of shortages. Famine refugees would come to Bombay because they had no other alternatives, and the famine policy of the government of India was proving inadequate and incompetent. Viti was the best example of it at the time, of this movement of people. And I suppose when you asked earlier what's the significance of Viti, it's its ability as a station and as a terminus to carry unexpected loads, and Viti is always one of the places where the unexpected loads are demonstrated. In the late 1890s, early 1900s, when Bombay suffered a series of terrible outbreaks of plague, there was an epidemic where people were dying in their thousands. And the British government was forcing people into segregation camps. People rushed to Viti to get away from the plague, and they filled up the railway platforms, and trains would come into Viti, empty out people who were on those carriages, and the carriages would be filled by the refugees from this epidemic. And in that sense, Viti was a transition point and an escape out of the dirty city, the city that was polluted and was the cause of illness. It was also a place where much that is to be proud of happened. It was in front of Viti is the space where many roads cross each other, an area known as Boribanda. This was a space which during the nationalist struggle in the 1920s and 1930s, during the Congress and Mahatma Gandhi's civil disobedience movement, it was during that time, in this space, in Boribanda, that nationalists would protest against British rule. So you would have people marching from Kalbadevi, from Crawford Market area, from Girgaon and Takurdwar, and so many of the places in the areas where Indian middle class and upper working class people were concentrated. The Satyagrahis would move from these areas, march to Viti and sit down in protest and perform satyagraha, and they'd stay there. And meanwhile, people going home from work to get into the trains with Viti would be seeing what was happening, and the message of non-violence and the message of national struggle would be forced upon these people returning home. The Great Fire, the Great Naval Fire, was an extraordinary event. There were explosions, bullion blew up, the air apparently had a golden sparkle. It was an absolutely disastrous occasion, a catastrophe where so many people were killed. It was important to Viti partly because it was so near Viti, because Viti, of course, also, as we said earlier, is adjacent to the harbour and to the wharves and jetties and so on. So that affected the movement of traffic to and from by rail. Viti was a late statement of the impact of the railway system. As you know, the railways were started in 1853. The first railway line went from that area to Thane and then Kalyan later. It was also the time when the British were connecting India through the telegraph lines, and these railways and telegraph tended to go together. For the average person, it meant mobility of a kind that wasn't there. In the 1820s, Maria Postins talks of travelling from Bombay to Pune, and it takes her 2 months because she sails across the harbour, she has an enormous convoy of people to carry her tents, her food, all her things. And so it takes her ages to get there. But the railway lines, as they're built, break this down. Initially, there was discussion as to whether untouchability practices should be allowed in the railway carriages. And as you know, that was forbidden, and people of different castes and classes sat together. The railway lines thus enabled movement between parts, and it meant that things like, there was a Delhi Durbar in 1877 when Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. Now what happened then was every Maharaja and Prince in India attended this event, which would have been difficult for them to do without the railways. Leading lawyers and doctors, activists, public men and women also attended. And it was the first time that leading figures in Bombay were able to talk to their counterparts from Calcutta. Later on, the ability of the trains to carry people meant that when the Indian National Congress met, which had always met during the period from Christmas and the New Year, when the courts and colleges and places were all closed, they were able to move around and meet in different parts because of the railways. And Vitti was one of those sites where things came into Bombay and left through a different route, either through shipping or else through the railway lines. And both before independence and after independence, Bombay has a global role through this bridgehead of the railway line and its associated port facility connections. During the American Civil War, their supplies of cotton were stopped for export, instead of which Indian cotton suddenly had a market. The railways brought the cotton into Bombay, where it sat on the docks waiting for export. So again, the railway system is important. Even before the railway lines, though, rich Indians in Bombay had made their fortune out of the sale of opium and the export of opium to Hong Kong. The railways again would have carried it, although that trade pretty much disappeared later on. In one sense, Vitti and the Gateway of India had both become symbols of Bombay. If somebody wants a logo image that provides an immediate identity for a place, then they'll choose either Vitti or the Gateway of India. In this sense, then, Bombay has totally taken Vitti into its own. Although it is a World Heritage Site, which links it to its past, its British past, but also to all its other pasts. Although it is a heritage site, it's also been colonised and has become a Bombay site primarily. Most Bombay people I know don't care particularly that it is a World Heritage Site. But on the other hand, they're proud of Vitti anyway. It should be celebrated in things that can be taken in by passengers as they rush out. There should be an enormous model of the first train somewhere prominent that people can see as they march through.